Yeah, hello. This is the first video of a new video series on narrative visualization. I want to discuss selected papers that I find interesting, inspiring, and a good guidance if you are interested in doing narrative visualization yourself. As the title image, I've always used the same, an example from our own work from Monique Moischke. Our own work is always dedicated to medical visualization, so we thought about explaining diseases. Yeah, we have a certain narrative structure, an implicit structure visible here by different, I would say, chapters. We have visualizations, we have textual components. We tried to find simplified, appealing visualizations on the one hand. We highlight certain structures in the visualizations as well as in the text, and we want to communicate a certain intent. For example, make people aware of avoidable risk factors for a disease. Yeah, so that's our own focus. But here I want to introduce a paper from others, and actually a series of them, and I want to start with a paper that's entitled Understanding Data Videos, Looking at the Narrative Visualization Through the Kinematography Lens, from Feretesh Amini, Nathalie Henri Rich, Bongshin Lee, Christoph Hörter, and Purang Irani. So these are quite famous people for storytelling with data and narrative visualization. And here they deal with data videos. That is one of the 7 narrative genres as introduced by Siegel and Hare in their seminal paper on narrative visualization. If not stated otherwise, and I think there is no exception, all the images presented in the following are from this paper that I want to introduce to you. I want to start this talk like usual. There is an outline. I have to make the topic a little bit more clear. Then there is a large part where 50 data videos are carefully analyzed with respect to the visualization types that were used in these data videos, with respect to attention cues. That means how the authors try to guide the viewer's attention toward certain parts of the data and of the visualization that is particularly interesting for the current stage of the narration. The different parts of the videos are categorized according to narrative categories. That is based on an earlier paper from Cohen. And then there are some statistics, e.g. how often certain narrative categories occur, in which sequence do they occur, so that one gets a little understanding of, on the one hand, typical patterns in these data videos, but also on the variability that, of course, exists as well. And the paper has a second part that is at least as interesting as the first part, namely, they investigated how practitioners actually create such videos, professional people with a lot of experience in this area. So that serves to identify, maybe one can call it a workflow of creating data videos. And it will turn out that there are similarities in how different people approach this problem, but of course also considerable differences. The practitioners all got some data, some statistics, the same data, and they had 3 hours time in order to prepare a video, and that was then analyzed. And of course, at the end, I want to discuss this a little bit. The evaluation, I think, is really useful and quite inspiring, but nevertheless, it has some limitations that I want to mention. And I also want to think a little bit about the take-home message. So what are the contributions of this paper? There was a comprehensive analysis of data videos. These are all professional data videos. 50 were selected. I will later describe the specific criteria, what makes a video appropriate for this analysis and what not. And the analysis was focused on high-level narrative structures as they could be derived from film theory. And the structuring was carried out according to 4 narrative categories: establisher, initial, peak and release. I think peak is the one that's self-explanatory, so that's somehow the highlight, the culmination point of these videos. The others I have to explain a little bit later, but you can already imagine that establisher and initial is something that typically occurs before the peak, and release occurs after the peaks. Yeah? So there is a temporal order in these 4 categories. And the focus is on attention cues. Yeah? What did the authors do in order to guide the viewer's attention with some kind of highlighting, for example, and data visualization type. And the evaluation served primarily to get some insights on the creation process. Yeah, so that one can learn from these professional people. So this paper appeared in 2015, 5 years after Seagal and Hare's work. So that was not the first paper on narrative visualization, and therefore it, of course, has had a previous work discussion, related work discussion, that is focused on storytelling in visualization, on data journalism. That means things you can observe if you look in the online variant of the New York Times or the Economist or other journals that adopted online techniques quite early. The whole work was to a large extent motivated by the spread of infographics, yeah, that are frequently used in data journalism, and the reception of all these developments in the InfoVis community. Yeah, so among the papers that were discussed were, for example, papers on memorability in visualizations and engagement in visualizations, yeah, more recent evaluation criteria for information visualization, but it was also discussed how rhetorics can be applied in narrative visualization, Jessica Hullmann's work, and what are typical structures and grouping principles in narrative visualization, again a paper from Jessica Hullmann. The related work discussion also includes some authoring tools that were even at that time available, like Tableau story points, where I would assume that it is a little bit more frequently used, and GeoTime series. I had a look at this. These are rather complex visualizations of developments in space and time. So I assume that this is a little less frequently used if it comes to developing things for a general audience. But nevertheless, it's inspiring to look at this as well. Yeah, let me come to the analysis of the videos, the first of the 2, I would say, core components of this paper. The inclusion criteria, how they actually selected their 50 data videos, were as follows. They selected only videos that contain a core message that was clearly recognizable. Yeah, so the authors had a communicative intent, a narrative intent. They want to make people aware of something, or they want even to change the attitude of people towards something, to trigger some action, for example. That would mean the videos had a core message. So it's not just here are a number of facts that are somehow interesting and informative. The second criterion was that the arguments in the paper, in the video, are supported by data. Yeah, you can imagine many narrations that do not include any data. Yeah, but here the occurrence of data was a further criterion. And another one was that visualizations were included. Again, you may imagine that you create a narration on something purely based on text, audio text or written text, carefully structured with emphasis, bold font, for example. But here data videos with visualizations were selected. And it should also follow a clearly recognizable narrative format, and that basically means there is a sequence of events. Yeah, that's a core criterion for a narration, that there is a sequence of events, and often there is a causal relation between them, so it's quite clear that one event has to happen before another one. And then they coded these videos with respect to the 2 aspects I already mentioned, the data visualization type, so for example, whether bar charts or pie charts or Venn diagrams have been used, and the attention cues. So here is the analysis with respect to the visualization types that were used in these videos, and I want to start with the most frequently used visualization types, and that is if I remember correctly, these are percentages. So 20% of all data videos contain bar charts, a little less than 50% contain pictographs. This goes back to Otto Neurath from the 1930s, a human-like figure that serves the purpose of personalization. Maps were used quite frequently. Yeah, so these are the most frequently used techniques, and there are many others like line charts, pie charts, and donut charts. So if you want to convey the portion of something. Scatter plots are not so frequently used. That's a technique that's very familiar to scientists, but for a broad audience, even a scatter plot is not so simple. Hierarchical visualizations were used sometimes, yeah. Trees, so here it explains indeed it is percentage. So 19% means probably, or 18%, 9 of the 50 videos contains bar charts. Some techniques were used probably by just 1 of the 50 videos, like Venn diagrams, calendars, and tech clouds. Yeah, so that gives an impression of the visualizations that were used in this selection that is probably not perfectly representative, but probably quite good to convey what are typical visualization types in data videos. And here are the attention cue types. One is strongly dominating, and that's animation. Yeah, animation really guides our attention to a strong extent. We cannot avoid to look at something that moves if everything else is static. So if the important information involves some kind of movement, it is very effectively emphasized. Other techniques were used, like highlighting, for example. You change the color of something, for example, or the brightness, or you de-emphasize other structures, reducing the saturation there. Size changes and zooming are a little bit similar, so the consequence is that the important information appears larger, but here only the size of the important information is changed, whereas zooming means that the whole portion of what you see gets smaller, so you lose a little bit the context there. Sound effects, of course, may be quite useful. Pointing could include something like encircling something, or drawing an arrow towards some information. That is another technique that was, yeah, I would not say very frequently, but also not too rarely. Yeah, the different attention cue types. So, and now let's come to these 4 narrative categories that were used in order to structure the videos, so that one could say here is a certain structure that belongs to this category or to this category. Establisher, that is, yeah, maybe one can say the introduction. You present some facts that should make the reader interested, yeah, should trigger curiosity on the side of the viewer. For example, in case of a medical topic, I would mention here how frequent a disease is, maybe how frequent among women and men, and how severe it is. So that shouldn't be too long. Yeah. For a video of 2 or 3 minutes, this part should not be more than 20 seconds, for example. Yeah. And then there are certain narrative structures that are categorized as initial structures. Something that prepares the peak, the highlight. Yeah, some actions are shown there. So, for example, in medicine, you could show how a person is diagnosed within a CT or MRI scanner, or how a treatment actually takes place. Yeah. So the peak then is where the most important things happened, and I emphasize 2 words here in the explanation taken from the paper from Kohn. the culmination of an event or the confluence of several sequences. So you might have different things that come together at the peak. Yeah? And after the peak, there is a release stage where you provide some additional information, repeat also some facts. So repetition is important in the release stage, that should help that people can remember important things from this data video. In the analysis of the 50 videos, it turns out that most of the videos contain at least 3 of these 4 categories. A considerable number contains all 4 categories. Most videos contain one clearly recognizable peak. There are a few with several peaks, but in most cases there is just one peak. Whereas in contrast, there is not only one structure that is categorized as initial, for example. So here's an example of a video with an overall duration of a little bit more than 2 minutes, which is quite typical. The short establisher scene, so that's from the whole 2 minutes, probably 10 seconds, not more. Then there is this initial stage with 4 different structures, shots that are somehow presented and animated. And then there is the peak, again as short as the establisher part, the highlight. And in this video, more than half comes after the peak, the aftermath, where some additional information or repetitive information is presented. So if I remember correctly, that was the average over all the 50 videos. Sorry. So you see here that compared to this special video, the release stage on average is shorter. It's not more than half of the video, but more something like 25%, whereas the preparation for the peak, the initial category, consumes about 50% of the overall duration. The peak is short and the establisher part also. So with respect to these categories, this special video is quite typical. Yeah, let me describe a little bit more what happens in these different categories: establisher, initial, peak, and release. Again, these 4 that we have seen already. And it's maybe a bit confusing that colors are here used as well, but they have a slightly different semantics, like in the previous slide where they encoded the category. Yeah. So here they encode the specific means that were used. So for example, whether a question was used, rhetorical question. What do you estimate how many people, how many women are in leading positions in science or in industry? Yeah, that could be such a question to start here in the establisher scene. Also in the peak there are questions, but typically not in the release stage. Yeah. New facts occur basically in all categories, and personally for me it was a bit surprising to see that new facts are even introduced here. Repetition, of course, cannot take place in the initial scene, only in all the following categories. And here in particular in this initial category, it's quite typical that something is deliberately designed in such a way that tension should be increased. So the establisher often is a rhetoric question, the peak, the shortest periods. And we have seen that repetition occurs quite frequently. Typically, repetition means that different perspectives or views on the same data are presented. So something has maybe a new aspect, but partially repeats what was said and described before. And I mentioned already, I found it a bit surprising that new facts come also after the peak, but for a professional person in this area, probably that would not be too surprising. Let me describe the second part of the paper. That's the investigation of the actual workflow of practitioners. And I like really the whole strategy of this evaluation. They could attract practitioners that have considerable experience, and they let them work together. So they were not isolated. And I think that is a good idea, because in practice, such a data video is also not created by just one person. Yeah, there could be one person that's more talented for selecting visualization techniques, for example, whereas another person is more competent with respect to creating a narrative and building tension, for example. Yeah, so 6 pairs of experts developed videos in a 3-hour session. So 3 hours is a lot on the one hand, but on the other hand, probably not enough to create a professional data video with all stages. Yeah, so that's a limitation. 6 hours would probably be better, but you can imagine it would be difficult to get practitioners for 6 hours. So the data set that were used, all the pairs of experts had the same data set related to marriage statistics, and there are data facts such as the majority of divorces takes place between 40 and 44 years, the average duration of marriages, the number of marriages that gets divorced later, and how this changes over time. Yeah, so that's the kind of data for which a data video should be generated. Yeah, a hand-drawn storyboard was presented for the experts from the authors for orientation. So one could say, in some sense, they were directed a little bit in a certain direction. They were given some guidance. I think this also served the purpose of making it possible for the experts to actually design something within a rather short period of 3 hours. So the experts used the typical things that you need for sketching: pens, markers, rulers, scissors, and sticky notes are used quite extensively. Yeah. So here are some examples. Yeah, what was done to engage the viewers, to hook the viewers. Yeah. So for example, here they thought about the royal wedding between William and Kate in 2012. And the royal wedding about Charles and Diana, yeah, including videos of this wedding, so that this becomes really concrete and specific, and may be useful to actually raise interest in this topic. Yeah, and here are some facts that should be conveyed. So, for example, in 1981, when this marriage took place, 62% of people were married, and only 49%, considerably lower, when William and Kate married. So that was the rhetorical question: are they going to divorce, William and Kate? Yeah, because a considerable number of marriages gets divorced. So, and that's maybe the major image to convey what happened in these 3 hours. Yeah, so we see what different people did. That is color coded here according to this color scheme. So first, of course, they had to read and interpret the data. So it typically starts with green here. Yeah, sometimes longer green stages. But they have not only read and interpreted the data in the very beginning, but some pairs did this also at later stages. So they come back to the data once to find something they may have forgotten or were not aware of, and then think about how to visualize. Yeah. So this blue stage here, select, means how to present the data and which visualization technique to use. So that consumed, I would say, at least a third of the overall time. Craft the narrative, making a structure, thinking about the events and their sequence, was a little less than a quarter of the time, and a little more than a quarter of the time is how to engage the viewer, how to really make people interested in this. So you see in these different groups that, for example, engaging the viewer here consumes a lot of time. Yeah, so here this was done much more than here. These icons here say whether people really worked together in a certain stage or did something alone, yeah, whether an activity was carried out by one or both experts. Yeah, so that's an overview of the activities, of their sequence. You see some recurring patterns, and you can see that there are considerable individual differences. Yeah, what was actually done to engage the viewers? So, for example, using icons or pictograms was used for personification. Realistic objects were used, such as wedding rings or wedding cakes, so something that really bring people in the mood of thinking about marriages. Yeah, even videos of actual marriages, for example, of the royal marriages. Yeah, the royal marriages, of course, are quite useful because so many people have actually seen them. In the process of selecting techniques, the experts commented later that they tried a lot to reduce complexity. They thought about simplification and about the selection of appealing techniques, aesthetically appealing techniques. And with all this, they tried to be aware of the fact that they design something for a broad audience where the visual literacy is probably low. At least you cannot assume a high visual literacy. And crafting the narrative structure, here in this category, a considerable time was dedicated to identifying the peak, the closing scene, and the takeaway message. The closing scene indeed should get a lot of attention. That is known from user experience design and became known as the peak end rule from Daniel Kahneman. From an experience, people will remember two things primarily, that is the peak and the end. Yeah, and therefore the closing scene is so important. There were intense discussions also on the opening scene, yeah, where the goal was to hook the viewer, for example, with controversial statements or statements that are contrary to mainstream opinion. Yeah, something that really makes you think about it. Yeah, what are the limitations of this work? The experts worked a relatively short amount of time and also outside of their normal working environment. Yeah, experts typically have a working environment that is carefully adapted to their needs, and if you move them to an artificial lab, that is an artificial situation where they will not do everything exactly in the same manner. So therefore, conclusions about their working style must be made with care. Yeah, some experts commented even that they left something out they would usually do because within this 3-hour time frame there was not enough time for this. So that clearly shows that 3 hours is not enough for the actual work. But nevertheless, I think a lot of interesting insights could be made of this. Yeah. So as a take-home message, I would say this paper really provides insights into the practice of practitioners, and that is very useful if you want to create an authoring tool that supports exactly these people. Yeah, you cannot design and develop such a tool successfully if you are not really aware and have a good understanding of the processes that they carried out. Visualization techniques and attention cues are major aspects, and that was for me personally quite interesting how strongly the experts thought about personification. So if I think of medical applications, I would say a good narration contains physicians, yeah, even the voice and the face of a physician, patients, or maybe even parents or partners or children of patients that are also strongly involved in a disease and maybe even important in coming up with a treatment decision. Pictograph type visualizations were frequently used in data videos in general, and I think that is of course also relevant for medical story generation, where we basically think about patients and physicians, so there this is a quite natural choice. Yeah, the last slide will always be the references, and here is again the paper that I introduced, Understanding Data Videos, looking at narrative visualization through the kinematography lens, so film. Theoretic knowledge was applied here for the analysis, and the major ingredient that they have used is the theory on visual narrative structure from Kohn. Yeah, thanks a lot for your attention.